So when we talked last night, we looked at Moses' defeat of the giant Og, and we noted that he was a 13-foot horror, slain in a subterranean stronghold, the stronghold of Edrei, on the far side of Jordan. And we saw there an old man. This is the end of Moses' life. An old man fighting giants in the dark. And we talked about the problem with giants, didn't we? The problem with giants is that they make us afraid. Fear itself is the giant. Giants may seem to be the stuff of childish stories, but fear is really and truly a giant that affects even the strongest of men and of women. And what we're going to see in Caleb is we're going to see a man who didn't see giants as any smaller than anyone else saw them. It wasn't that he had a problem with his eyesight and it shrunk people and he saw them as normal size. No, it's just that this man saw God as bigger. He saw God as bigger than any threat, any challenge that he faced. It wasn't that he was unafraid. He experienced fear like any one of us would. And there's a funny thing with fear. Fear undefeated never goes away. A fear unfaced just grows, looming ever larger until the fear of the fear itself can be larger than the original issue was. When I was little, maybe 3 years old, I had a severe asthma attack, actually the only one I've really had in my life. And I got taken to hospital, and for a variety of reasons, my parents couldn't be with me at the time. And during the night, an intern was dispatched to come down and take a blood sample from me. You can picture the scene. I was 3. I was all alone without my mum and dad, probably the first time in my life I'd been without mum and dad. And there's this man in the night about to stab me with a needle. I've got no memory of this moment, but I'm told that I screamed blue murder and I twisted and turned. What 3-year-old wouldn't when faced with such a situation? And apparently the intern bent the needle trying to get blood while I tried to escape. And this bit I do remember. I remember at one point I broke free from the nurses and the intern, and I remember running, sobbing, so scared down this darkened ward, trying to find somewhere to hide. And all my life, I've had a fear of hospitals and needles. Now, it helps that I've married a nurse because, well, I've had to overcome my fear of hospitals, and Ariel has helped me beat that one. But needles, I still almost pass out every time. But the funny thing is, I'm now more afraid of my fear of needles than I am of the needle itself. The giants of our youth, they leave scars, brothers and sisters. The fear of loneliness or the fear of awkwardness, fear of being different, of being an outcast, the fear of being thought foolish, or the fear of not being able to do the things others do, or as well as others do them, the fear of rejection. And what we want to look at this morning is we want to look at a man who, yes, he saw giants. He saw very many giants, but from that moment on, he made facing them, facing a whole nation's fear. This was the fear of all Israel. He made that, and defeating that fear, the engine room of his life. Fighting the fear of giants was going to be the driving force, I think, behind an exemplary life, the exemplary life of patient endurance that we're going to see in Caleb. And wow, what a story of endurance we'll see. We're first introduced to Caleb in the chapter we read for our reading last night, Numbers chapter 13, if you wouldn't mind going back there for a moment. Numbers chapter 13. And we see him in verse 6, that this is the list of the spies who were selected to go out and spy out the land. And in verse 6, we meet Caleb. Of the tribe of Judah, Caleb the son of Jephunneh. This man is clearly a ruler in Judah, a prince, one of its leaders, and he is the one appointed here as the most appropriate man from the entire tribe to go forth and be their spy. And you'll recall how we talked last night about how the spies travelled from Kadesh Barnea up the spine of the land, concealed amongst its barren peaks, until they reached its southern border, the southern border of Syria. Verse 21, they went up and they searched the land from the wilderness of Zin unto Rehob, as men come to Hamath, and they ascended by the south. So presumably what happened is they went up as a group, and then they came south again, perhaps splitting into pairs, travelling quietly, spying out the land. I don't know if you've thought about this, but as you read through this chapter, there's something a little unusual. Because in the whole journey south, it appears they only saw one city, just one city. On that whole journey from Syria in the north, back down south to Kirjath Jearim, they saw only one city. Hebron, the city of giants, the highest point in that range of mountains up the spine of the land. Did they really only see just one city? Well, verse 29. The spies return and they say the Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites. They'd seen all these people, and they dwell in the mountains. The Canaanites dwell by the sea, by the coast of Jordan. They'd seen so many people. Verse 28, nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled. Clearly, they had seen a lot of places. Verse 29 gave us an idea that they'd covered this large amount of territory in their six-week mission. How is it they only saw one city and one brook? Well, they didn't, did they? Verse 28 told us that they'd seen many cities. But you see, the problem is in this particular record that of all the spies, there are only two who survived long enough to contribute to Moses' record. Only two were given enough time to sit down with Moses afterwards and calmly recount exactly where they'd been and what they'd seen. The rest perished long before they were given that opportunity. So the events of verse 22 and verse 23, where they visit first Hebron and then the river or the brook Eshcol, they're clearly the record of Caleb and Joshua's survey. I'd suggest to you that even they saw more than two places on their journey. But I think for them, and certainly for Caleb, there were only two places that mattered. Only two places he cared to remember. Firstly, there was Eshcol. We visited there last night. It was named, wasn't it, for the bunch of grapes that were found there. There's a funny thing in this even, because you know that the Hebrew word used here for grapes is not the word any Jewish person would choose to use for grapes. The Jews had lots of words for grapes. It's a little bit like the Eskimo words for snow. Enab, just grapes. Sorek, the best of the grapes. Perit, a single grape, and on and on. They've got lots of words for grapes. the word they chose to use here, well, it means just a cluster. Not even a cluster of grapes, just a cluster. Can you see what's strange in that? If you were naming a place after something you saw there, they've chosen the wrong word. Choosing the word a cluster, just a cluster. It'd be a bit like visiting Adelaide and being struck by the very many churches. It's a city of many churches. I know what I'll name this place. I'll name it Many. Not many churches, or not churches, just many. It's almost as if they've chosen the wrong word, isn't it? The name, I think, that these spies chose, well, it tells us what was on their mind. When they named this place, they weren't trying to name it after the grapes. There was something weighing on their mind. They were remembering, I think, Eshcol, the Gentile believer in Abraham's army, the brother of Mamre, in whose fields, the fields of Mamre, Hebron lay. That was what was on their mind. As they went through, a cluster of grapes. A cluster. And it triggered a memory for at least one of those spies. And that became the name of the location. They didn't name it after the grapes. They named it after the man. The man who broke bread with Abraham and fought those who fought giants. And why was it? Why was it that Eshcol and Hebron, they saw so many other places? Why was it that these two places mattered so much to Caleb that even though they toured the whole land, this was all he saw? What did you see, Caleb? What did you see? Oh, well, we went everywhere. We saw everything. We saw Eshcol, we saw Hebron. We did it. That was the land. What else did you see? Oh, no, that was it. That was everything we saw. And by the way, yes, I think this was Caleb's train of thought that was focused on Eshcol and Hebron. And we'll see why soon. Well, to answer this question of why this was all that Caleb could remember, why this was what was buzzing in his brain when he returned back to the camp, we need to know a little bit more about Caleb. And Caleb's one of those subjects of controversy. I'm sure some of you will come up and talk to me about this one afterwards, but nonetheless, Caleb is a bit of an enigma. He's a bit of a mystery, isn't he? The record, at least in the King James Version, gives Caleb at least, as far as I can find, 4 different fathers in 4 different passages. That's a bit of an odd thing, isn't it? There are 4 different passages, each of us giving a different father to this man. His father's Joanna in some passages, Kenaz in another, Hezron in another, Hur elsewhere. So whose son was he? Well, a little bit of sleuth work yields some answers. You see, the first one there, Joanna, it's a name that only ever appears when describing Caleb. It never appears on its own. It never appears in an isolated family tree. It only ever appears when the scripture is telling us who Caleb is. To all intents and purposes, Joanna himself had no father in Israel. That's interesting, isn't it? On the other hand, Caleb is described elsewhere as being the son of Hezron. Now, Hezron was the grandson of Judah, as it's recorded in Chronicles. So, here's a question. How can they be the son? How can Caleb be the son of 2 men? Caleb, the son of Joanna, says it a number of times. Caleb, the son of Hezron. We know they're the same person because both these characters have the same daughter. Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, has a daughter whose name is, I'm just trying to check my notes, Aksah. And Caleb, the son of Hezron, has a daughter whose name is Aksah. This daughter, both these daughters, marry a man named Othniel. It's the same daughter. It's unlikely that two men would have one daughter, isn't it, and marry the same man. So we can assume that both these Calebs are the same person. And there's a real question here. How can he be the son of these two men? Well, this is where another one of his fathers, Kenaz, helps us out a little bit. See, Kenaz. Prior to the time of Caleb, there is only one Kenaz in the record. And he isn't a Jew. Here's where he is. Genesis 36. This is the record of the genealogy of Esau. And here we've got some of the sons and grandsons of Esau. And one of them, the only time this name occurs before the story of Caleb in the record, is called Kenaz. This Kenaz, in the story of Genesis 36, is not a Jew. He's an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that doesn't really help us out. That's a completely different man. But you see, I think the point is that Caleb wasn't a Hebrew. Think about it for a minute. The man most frequently mentioned as his father is missing from the line of Judah. I think Caleb was a Gentile, an Edomite. That's why one of his ancestors is mentioned as being Kenaz. I think he was the son of Jephunneh, but he had somehow joined the tribe of Judah and been adopted into the family of Hezron. And if this is true, if that's an adequate fitting together of the different passages that describe Caleb, it would explain a number of strange things in the record, a number of oddities. It would help us explain why someone would name their son Caleb. Many of you will have a marginal note next to Caleb saying, a dog. Now, this is not a word that in anywhere else in the whole of Scripture has a positive connotation. There is not one good dog in the Bible. Why would you name someone Caleb, the dog? Unless, of course, you were trying to make a rather unpleasant point. A Gentile dog, perhaps. It would also explain if Caleb was from the family of Edom, adopted into the tribe of Judah, it would explain a number of odd names that appear in Caleb's descendants, in his family tree. When we trace the children and grandchildren of Caleb, we find names like Shobal and Manahath and Elah and Onam and Korah. These are names that find their predecessor in the Edomites, not in Israel. Family names taken from Esau. And if Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, was a Gentile, that would explain a very odd turn of phrase in Joshua chapter 15, verse 13. It says that under Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he gave a part among the children of Judah. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but it doesn't go through the rest of the record listing every member of the family of Judah and describing that unto so-and-so, Salmon, he gave a part among. No, it's almost as if this is unusual. It's a flagging, an oddity, something strange. We need to note, says Joshua, that God gave a part among the children of Judah to Caleb. There's almost a tone of surprise there. it was given unto him among them, as though he were a foreigner. And it would also explain this passage here. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite unto this day, because he wholly followed Yahweh God. And you could put a full stop there, couldn't you? But it doesn't. Of Israel. As if to remark on the strangeness of choosing this phrase when connected with Caleb. I think Caleb was a proselyte. I think he was a foreigner. I think he was part of that mixed multitude. And that helps us explain his perspective. When he saw a cluster of grapes, Eshcol Enab, cluster of grapes, he didn't think of the Enab, the grapes. He thought of Eshcol, a Gentile participant in Abraham's covenant. And on his Bible Lands bucket list, there was just one entry, one place alone that he was interested in. It was Hebron, because that was the place where Abraham, the possessor of the covenant, dwelt with 3 Gentile proselytes. That's why these places mattered to Caleb. These places represented Caleb's hold on the promises. For Caleb, it was not a present-day promise of an inheritance in the promised land. He did not believe that he would enter the land with Israel and immediately be given land to own and to possess. No, he was a foreigner. Of all the spies, he alone had no right to possess. He alone had been promised nothing. No, for him, Eshcol and Hebron spoke of a distant time, a time when in Abraham all families of the earth would be blessed, of a time when Abraham himself once more would walk the land with Anak and Mamre and Eshcol, those who broke bread with him in Hebron. You know that Caleb could even become a leader in Judah tells a lot to us about Judah as a tribe. And it says a lot about Caleb as a man as well. Clearly, Caleb did not join Israel during the plagues, but earlier. I'd suggest sometime during Moses' 40-year absence in the wilderness in Midian. For in order to become a leader in Judah in little more than 12 months, because there's 12 months time here or less from the departure from Egypt to the point where the spies are selected, in order to become a leader, a prince in Judah in such a short amount of time, that seems quite unlikely. And as a spy, he saw giants on Hebron's walls. He went to Hebron and he saw the same things others saw. But unlike the spies, he saw something different. Unlike the other 10, the wonders of the 10 empire-crushing plagues, the Red Sea crossing, the fire of Sinai, the pillar of cloud that dwarfed giants in his mind, he saw those things. They were what towered in his mind's eye. Chapter 14, verse 9, he says, "Only rebel not ye against Yahweh, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them. Yahweh is with us." The shade is gone. That's such an interesting phrase. I wouldn't be at all surprised if in his mind he saw a pillar of fiery cloud towering over an Egyptian army. Their shade was gone as they were lit by the flames inside the fire that separated them from Israel. In his mind, to lose shade was to stand lit by the fire of God and threatened by it. He remembered all those events of the wilderness wandering, and they stuck out so much more in his mind. And so he saw giants. Yes, they were frightening, but something else loomed larger, and that was the might and power of God, the God with them. So that's the beginning of Caleb's story. What we want to do now is do almost the same as what we did with Moses, and we need to go down to the end of Caleb's story. We're going to jump forward some 45 years. We're going to go now to Joshua chapter 14. And we want to look at, Caleb's first recollection, his recollection of his first sighting of Hebron. 45 years have now elapsed since that first time he clamped eyes on Hebron's battlements. There's been 38 years in the wilderness, haven't there? Spent nursing a nation condemned to die in the wilderness. Imagine what that would have been like for Caleb. 38 years of imprisonment in the wilderness when you've already got your entry pass to the land. God's already signed off on that. He said that in Numbers 14:24. These men, they're going to get to go in. Caleb especially. God singles him out by name to say, Caleb will go in. And for 38 weary, long years, he stayed with an ecclesia that God had said was condemned. They were a holy nation, a royal nation of priests, but condemned by God, their lives cut short, falling, as we said, like leaves in the cold autumn wind, dying almost while Caleb looked on. That would have been absolutely heartrending for Caleb. And then after that, then there was 7 years of frenetic warfare supporting Joshua's campaigns in the land. And imagine what that was like for this man. 7 years of fighting in a war where you were just about the oldest man in the army. There would be no one his own age. He was the second oldest warrior in the entire nation by this point. That's got to make you feel your age, brothers and sisters. And still he kept going. What was it that drove Caleb on? Into his 70s, his 80s, his 90s. And still out there fighting with younger men. Well, Joshua 14, verse 7, here it is. 40 years old, says Caleb, was I when Moses, the servant of Yahweh, sent me from Kadesh Barnea. I think I got that name wrong earlier. From Kadesh Barnea to espy out the land. And I brought Moses word again as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me, such a lovely thing to say of men condemned to death, my brethren that went up with me made the heart of the whole people melt, but I wholly followed Yahweh my God. And Moses sware on that day, saying, surely the land wherein thy feet have trodden shall be thine inheritance and thy children's forever, because you have wholly followed Yahweh my God. And now, behold, Yahweh has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, 38 in the wilderness, 7 fighting battles, even since Yahweh spoke this word unto Moses while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, lo, I am this day 85 45 years old. This man was driven on for all those years by an event that happened 45 years before. He was driven on by Moses' promise in verse 9. That's what motivated him. 45 years ago, he, a Gentile, had been promised an inheritance. Which inheritance had he been promised? Well, it was the land he had trodden on. And you see, Caleb took this very, very literally. Verse 12, now therefore give me this mountain, whereof God spoke to me that day. That day I trod on the mountain, that's mine. He didn't take it as a sort of general, I'll give you an inheritance somewhere in the land you walk through. No, my feet stood at Hebron. My footprint was at the mud at the foot of that city. It's mine. Moses made me a promise that the land I trod on was mine. I trod on Hebron, on this mountain, so Hebron is mine. And in taking this so very literally, in heading to Hebron, Caleb was actually following an older example. Let's go back to Genesis again. Genesis chapter 13. The connections here are really, I think they're lovely. Genesis 13 and verse 14. We know this story really well. Yahweh said to Abram after that lot was separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward and westward. All the land which you see, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. I will make your dust as the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall your seed be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length and in the breadth of it, and I will give it to you. Walk through the land, God says to Abraham. That's the land I'll give you. Wherever you walk, you will get that land. And so what does Abraham do? God says, walk through the land where your feet tread. That's the land you'll get. Verse 18, then Abraham removed his tent and came promptly and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron. Can you see the connection there? Walk in the land, that's the land I give you. And so Abraham packs up his tents and moves promptly to Hebron. Verse 18, the highest point in the land, the point from which he could see it all. And back in Joshua chapter 14, verse 12, Caleb says this. He says, now therefore give me this mountain. Give me this mountain. Give me the mountain that the Lord had spoken of. But you know what? God hadn't promised him a mountain. God didn't say, I will give you the mountain where your feet tread. He said, I'll give you the land. He'd been promised the land. But you see, as far as he was concerned, he'd only been to one place. When people said to him, what do you remember of the land? Oh, there was a mountain. There was one place that stuck out in his mind. Mount Hebron. And in fact, you get a sense of that in verse 10. Look at what he says in verse 10. He says, now behold, Yahweh's kept me alive these 45 days, so on, so on. I wandered with the children of Israel. And now, lo, I am this day 45 years old. It's almost as if he's saying to us, I remember the very moment I first saw Hebron. It was 45 years ago today. I've been celebrating my birthday from that day forward. And this is my 45th birthday from the day I saw Hebron for the first time. I'll never forget it. And he calls it a mountain. Do you know what? No one else called Hebron a mountain. They called it Hebron. You go through the Bible, people don't call it a mountain. Why is he called it a mountain? Well, I think it's another little clue for us, because you see, The men who owned Hebron, Mamre, and Anah, and Eshcol were specifically told they were Amorites. Do you know what Amorite means? It means mountain dweller. And he wanted the mountains. This place stood out in his mind. But think about it. He's going to fight giants. He knows that. To capture Hebron. Fighting giants in your 40s, that's one thing. Fighting them in your 80s, that's another thing altogether, isn't it? And Caleb does not undermine or forget the challenges of this. Read again verse 12. Now therefore give me this mountain whereof Yahweh spoke in that day, for you heard in that day how the Anakims were there, and that the cities were great and fenced. If so be that Yahweh will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out, as Yahweh hath said. You see what he's saying in this passage? He's saying, I've got complete confidence in God's ability to help me capture this city, but none of my own. If so be God will do it, I can. I might be 85, but if God is with me, that there's no bravado here. There's no sort of sense of, just don't show me the right way and I'll deal with it. No, if God is with me, I can do it if he's with me. There's no self-confidence. There's also no false humility. His will is still strong. Verse 11, I'm as strong this day as I was in the day that Moses sent me. As my strength was then, even so is my strength now for war, both to go out and to come in. He's not falsely humble, but his confidence is first in God. And what an example. What an amazing example. Not just for the young in our ecclesia, but particularly, I think, for the seniors in the meeting. Those, perhaps, who feel tired out by the years. Here is an antidote to what ails us, to that weariness and inertia. Firstly, Caleb is motivated by a single-minded, unswerving focus on God's promises. God said I could do it. God said it will happen. He said. And secondly, he took God at his word. He had a simple confidence that God will. Not me, him. And finally, he possessed an honesty that acknowledged the challenges, but saw God as greater than them. God said, God will, God can. A mindset to live by. And so Joshua blessed Caleb. And the record reads in this chapter almost as if Caleb gets this blessing from Joshua and then off he goes, straight off, and conquers Hebron. That's it, we're done. But that's not what happened. It appears that there's as much as another 12 years that pass until Judges chapter 1. Let's go there. Judges chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Because look at what it says. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked Yahweh, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? And Yahweh said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into Judah's hand. Joshua is now dead. That means Caleb is now approaching 100 years old. Verse 10, and Judah went up against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron before was Kirjath-Arba, and they slew Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai, and from thence he went against the inhabitants of Debir, and the name of Debir before was Kirjath-Sepher. And Caleb said, this is now finally Caleb's war. 100 years old. You know, this is remarkable. Caleb had seen the effect of giants on the whole nation. Back come the spies. We saw giants. Caleb steals the nation. No, we were as grasshoppers in their sight, say the spies. And the whole nation weeps. Every tent with someone crying, there's giants. Caleb had seen that. He'd seen that attitude, that spirit, that fearful mindset sweep through the entire nation. And yet, here he manages to motivate his whole tribe, his adopted tribe, to join him in taking Hebron. What did that? It's really only one thing that does that, isn't it? It's passion, an example, an elderly brother leading from the front. You know, Hebron, in addition to being a fortified mountaintop stronghold, as we've said many times, was home to the Anakim. Now, the Anakim is a name that could mean two things. It could mean either long-necked, that is, tall, or it could mean to choke and to strangle. But either way, it doesn't matter. The three Anakim of Hebron would have been fearsome. As we've already seen, these Anakim were proverbial. Even the people of Egypt with their mighty armies knew the Anakim. Who can stand before the children of Anak was the proverb that everyone knew. Who can stand? That is to say, who among you won't run when you see an Anakim? Now, we don't know how big these particular Anakim were. We're given no guidelines as to their size, but we do have a lower bound. We know that they can't be shorter than a certain height. Because 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 23, introduces us to an Egyptian, a man of great stature who was 5 cubits high. Now, note what this passage doesn't say. This man is not a giant. He's just a man of great stature. Simply a big guy. He's 5 cubits high. Now, I've had some questions about the cubit and how long the cubit is. And yes, there were multiple different cubits down through history. But roughly, a cubit is 500 mil, give or take. So our Egyptian here would have been 2.5 meters tall. Not a giant. Which I think means we can say that the Anakim in Hebron would have been probably around 9 foot tall. That's pretty scary. It'd be scary for me in my 40s. Imagine how it would feel when you were 100. But Caleb had spent his life preparing. He'd spent a life obsessing, planning for this one particular battle. He was ready. He had everything sorted. And yet, the amazing thing is that when the battle finally arrives, when that day finally dawns, it's over in half a verse. Look at what it says, verse 10, second half of the verse. They went against Hebron. They slew Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Done. That's all the detail we get. More text is spent in this chapter on the battle for Bezek, a city that only ever appears in this verse, this chapter, and one other verse in the whole of the Bible. And nowhere more attention is devoted to the battle for Bezek than for the battle for giant-infested Hebron, that fortress in the mountains. It seems like a massive anticlimax, doesn't it? A lifetime spent, and he gets half a verse. And yet, when we follow what happens after this, something really interesting occurs. Come back, please, to Joshua chapter 14, verse 14. So Joshua chapter 14 is clearly summarizing a sort of broad swath of history. As we said, there's at least 12 years between the point at which Caleb spoke to Moses and had the promise reiterated, and finally Hebron is conquered. But look at what it says in verse 14 of Joshua chapter 14. Joshua 14, verse 14. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite unto this day, because that he wholly followed Yahweh God of Israel. Well, once again, the battle is a complete anticlimax. If anything, this is even more anticlimactic. What's the sum total of the description? It became Caleb's. Almost as if he knocked on the door and the door swung open, there was no one in. He just walked in, it was his. We know that's not what happened. But look at verse 15. And the name of Hebron before was Kirjath-Arba, which Arba was a great man among the Anakims, and the land had rest from war. Now, Hebrews chapter 4 talks about this point in time. I've replaced the Jesus in the AV with the Joshua as it should be, and it says, for if Joshua had given the children of Israel rest, God would not then have spoken of another day later on, the day of kingdom Sabbath rest, if you like. And what we're being told here is that the rest in the time of Joshua was a symbol, was a picture, was, if you like, an inheritance, a small part of the kingdom that was still to come. This rest was a taste of the kingdom. God's people at peace in the promised land. So when did that occur? When did that kingdom rest, if you like, happen in the history of Joshua? Well, look, it happens as soon as the nation had faced their giants. As soon as we have faced our fears. Now you might think, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. So giants and then peace. Is that giants and then the kingdom? Is that what you're saying? Well, flick across to Joshua chapter 11. Because Joshua chapter 11 is another summary chapter which gives us a broad swath of history and compresses it down into a few verses. And in verse 23 it says this, Joshua 11 verse 23, and Joshua took the whole of the land according to all that Yahweh had said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land had rest from war. There's that same phrase, the rest that Joshua gave to the people of Israel. But what was it that marked the end of their conquests and the beginning of that kingdom rest? Go one verse up, verse 22. there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod there remained. Do you see what's being said here? The summary of all Joshua's conquests, in symbol, Jesus' conquest, the summary of it all, it can all be compressed down to one thing, the high point of all those battles for the promised land, for our promised land, the defeat of giants. And Caleb's life, it's bookended by giants for us, isn't it? He enters the record staring up at Hebron's walls and at the sons of Anak, and he leaves it standing inside Hebron, a Hebron now free of giants. And it's funny, isn't it, how that the fears that we have in our youth leave scars. The fear of loneliness, the fear of not being able to do what others can do, of being thought foolish, the fear of rejection, of being different, of being a Gentile amongst Jews, of friendlessness. We face these fears in our youth. And again, I think as we age, as we find ourselves the oldest warriors still standing. And Caleb faced this head on. He recognized this fear. He didn't flee the fear. No, he attacked. I want you to come back to Numbers chapter 14, verse 24, because with this spirit, this wonderful spirit of Caleb's in mind, it's little wonder that God said these words that he said to Caleb in Numbers chapter 14, verse 24. He's just rebuked and condemned the spies and the nation that believed them. And in verse 24 he says, "But my servant Caleb, because he had another spirit in with him, and hath followed me fully, him will I bring into the land whereunto he went, and his seed shall possess it." You know what? That phrase, my servant, very few people were ever called the servant of God by God himself. Even Joshua was never called this until after he had died. But here is Caleb being told it to his face in front of the whole nation. Truly, this man had another spirit, a spirit that drove him on because he followed God fully. You know, we said way back at the beginning that his name meant dog, and it does. But like so many Hebrew names, it can be sliced differently. And the Hebrew word Koleb means wholehearted. A wholehearted, big-hearted servant of Yahweh. And when all the world was swaying in the wind, he stood firm. And when everybody else saw giants, and only giants, he saw something more. Come back again, sorry to have you flicking around a bit, to Joshua chapter 14, verse 7. Joshua chapter 14, verse 7. He saw something more. "40 years old when Moses, the servant of Yahweh, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again, as it was in my heart." The other 10, they reported what they saw. But Caleb reported what was in his heart. And what did he say? He said, "The land into which we have passed over to spy, it is a very, very good land." That was what was in his heart. It was a very, very good land. But Caleb saw even more than that, I think. He saw a Gentile with the first Hebrew. He saw a land in which rivers of milk and honey flow. He saw a mountain rising above all the rest, and he saw himself in it. I think he saw the kingdom. You know, we repeat this phrase, without a vision, the people perish. And they did for 38 years in the wilderness and for more. But this man, he had a vision deep in his heart. He knew there were giants to defeat. He knew there was the valley of Rephaim to traverse before glory. But he faced a whole nation's fear and he defeated it in his old age. What an example. And it wasn't even his nation. And because of this, because he wholly followed Israel's God, because he was driven by a vision in his heart, because he was Caleb, wholehearted in his pursuit of the promise given to Abraham in Hebron. Hebron, the home of the covenant, became his. Isn't that marvelous? And in the kingdom, I really hope that you and I are going to be there to witness something really special. Because I think what's going to occur in those first few moments of the kingdom will be one of history's most delicious and beautiful ironies. When Abraham emerges from the cave of Machpelah on Hebron's eastern slopes, Abraham's going to discover that, yes, the whole land that he trod is his. All of it. But the mountain in which his promise was received, in fact, the very place he emerges from and is standing, is not. He will discover, I think, that the land of Hebron belongs to a Kenizzite. In the same day said Yahweh to Abraham and made a covenant. He said, unto your seed I've given this land, from the river Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of all the nations, I've given it to you, Abraham. But right there in the center, at Hebron, there'll be a Kenizzite who owns Hebron, the wholehearted servant of Yahweh, Caleb. And do you know what? I think that Abraham will be absolutely thrilled.